me. Can I just want to start by acknowledging that we meet tonight on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. We're not looking for a whole bunch of new technologies. We've got most of the technologies we need right now. We're not, at a very high level, it's very simple. We've got to stop using fossil fuels. And to do that, we have to replace them with something. Wherever possible, we're going to replace, we're going to replace the fossil fuels with green electrons, so that's renewable energy. And where electrons don't work, such as steel making or fertiliser production, we're going to make green molecules, which is hydrogen and its derivatives, or maybe even bioenergy. And the exciting thing for Australia is that we live in an amazing country for renewable resources. We've got these boundless plains that we have in our national anthem, and they're windswept and they're sun-drenched, and they, excuse me for waxing lyrical there, and they, we have so much, and the best, some of the best in the world, that it can be some of the cheapest. And at the same time, we're blessed with the critical minerals that are required for the 21st century for this decarbonisation. So that's cobalt and nickel and silicon and lithium. You know, half the world's lithium at the moment is coming from Australia. It's quite incredible. So just want to just put it out there beginning that we often think about energy or emissions coming from the electricity sector and forget all the other parts of the economy. There are a bunch of different sectors. And I've got them here in order. Waste, that's the methane that bubbles up from our rubbish dumps, mainly from the rotting organic waste. Industrial emissions, things from, say, production of fertiliser or industrial processes that, you know, brick kilns and things like that. Fugitives, which is the emissions that you can't catch when you're mining coal or processing gas that get released directly into the atmosphere. Agriculture, that a good amount of that comes from cattle and other ruminants, but some of it, a significant amount, comes from crop waste and fertiliser use. Transport, of course, planes, trains, automobiles. Direct combustion, that's heating in our homes or heating in industry or heating water or air, and then the electricity sector, by far the biggest. Next slide, please. Our grid is very much in transition. This is a slide I love updating every month. We see black, the top line, which is coal, coming down, and we see orange at the bottom, gas. It did build up. Well, the numbers are just off the bottom there, but this is the last 20 years in the electricity market. You can see gas rose up, and that's for a while there, gas was cheap. As gas has become expensive and renewables become cheap, you can see that renewables, the turquoise line, shooting up. And I reckon those lines are going to cross in about 3 or 4 years, where we'll have more renewables than coal in Australia. It's going up and it's accelerating. Next slide. On Q&A about September last year, Kate Roffey said, well, the problem with all this renewable stuff is, where's the plan? I want to see the plan. We don't have a plan. We need to have a plan. Where is this plan? Next slide, please. Turns out we do have a plan. The first one there was Finkel's in 2017. Then AEMO did an update in 2018 and another one in 2020, and they're working on the 2022 update. A draft was released in December, and every time they do this plan, the future comes, every 2 years they do this plan, and the future seems to move forward about 5 years every time. Next slide, please. They have 4 different scenarios in the current plan. They call Hydrogen Superpower. Now this chart, just while I'm talking about it, I'll explain to you. On the left is the emissions of our electricity sector. We're up around about 140 million tonnes of CO2 a year from our electricity sector. And that's in the national electricity market, which is most of the electricity sector, like most of the electricity in Australia is about 80%, 90% is through that. And you see the line, several scenarios, a line coming down. They have 4 scenarios. One they call Hydrogen Superpower, and that's if Australia really gets its skates on and really captures that vision that Ross Garnaut outlaid so well in his think it was 2019 book, Superpower, where Australia takes advantage of our bountiful, abundant renewable energy resources and uses that both for exporting electricity in various forms and for transforming the minerals we have and exporting them. So hydrogen superpower is we really take advantage of the opportunity. Step change, they call that, they've designated that as the central scenario, the one that's most likely at the moment. Then progressive change means we're going to just bumble along sort of as we are. And slow change is if there is a massive global recession and everyone gives up on climate action. So no matter what happens, you see us coming dramatically down from around about 140 million tonnes right now. On the hydrogen superpower, we're out of coal by 2030, and the emissions from that sector goes from that 140 down to about 4. So massive change. Step change, we do sort of 80% of that fall in a few years longer, and then a little bit slower phase out. But somewhere we'll end up at the moment, I would say it's looking like we're going to be somewhere between step change and hydrogen superpower. But of course, it all depends on where we go with leadership in this country. Next slide, please. 10 years ago this year, the Greens did a crazy thing. They forced the energy market operator to produce a 100% renewable plan. And everyone went, that is impossible. You can't run a country on 100% renewables. AEMO begrudgingly wrote the report. By the end of the report, they said, oh, actually, you can do it, but it costs a fair bit of money. I think it would cost us all an extra $100 a year or something like that. But it seemed like it was still very far out there. This is from the executive summary of the latest report, and it shows the 4 scenarios. In hydrogen superpower, we're 100% renewable by 2030. Like that's just, we're saying that's absolutely achievable now. If we go a little bit slower on the step change, we get to 85% by 2030. So these are numbers that a few years ago you would have been accused of being with the fairies at the bottom of the garden. Now we're getting the people who run the electricity market saying, yeah, totally doable. It's just a matter of political will, how quickly, which of these scenarios we get to. But even in the slowest scenario, we're 80% renewable within about 15 years. Next slide. This is coal. So how do we get to 100% renewable? Obviously, we've got to get rid of coal. And the coal is coming out of the market not because we're forcing it to shut early, but because it can't compete with these new energy sources. AEMO under the central scenario, the step change, which is also called central scenario, the most likely, that the top of the bar charts is how much coal they think we need in the market, how much coal we will have. The dotted line is the announced closures. So everything between those are closures that are almost certainly going to happen, but haven't been announced yet. So we'll talk about that in a second. But you've seen a few announcements recently. There are going to be a lot more. Next, please. So here's one from nearly a year ago, March last year. It was announced that Yallourn, which Victoria's dirtiest and I think oldest coal power station down Latrobe Valley, obviously, announced that it was moving its closure date from 2032 up to 2028. I wouldn't be surprised if it moves closer to us again. Next slide. Just a week ago, or maybe, yeah, it's a week ago. Wow, time flies. Last Thursday, it was announced that Eraring, New South Wales' biggest coal generator in the country, would be closing instead of 2032, it would be 2025. Next slide. And many will have seen that Mike Cannon-Brookes announced a takeover bid for AGL. It's still got a fair way to go for that to happen, but under the plan that Mike and Brookfield, a Canadian infrastructure investor, but the plan they have is that AGL would be out of coal completely by 2030. So you've major. These 3 power stations that I showed you then that have been all announced closures, or likely closures of, plus Liddell. That's a lot of movement just in the last 12 months, and I would expect to see similar movement again in the next couple of years. Next slide. People always go, well, how are we going to keep the lights on if we don't have, we lose these coal power stations, how are we going to keep the lights on? We need dispatchable energy in our electricity system. Two kinds of energy really. There's variable renewables, which come and go as the weather pleases. Good thing is the sun comes up pretty much every day and the wind is blowing pretty much everywhere, pretty much somewhere strongly every day, but they do fluctuate. So we need to have, and demand fluctuates too, of course, with the weather, with the time of day, with public holidays. Our demand is also fluctuating. So we need something in the middle that firms it up, something that's available on demand. At the moment, that's coal and gas. When we phase them out, we still need things that we can turn on and off. And you can see under the red line here, well, this is a chart of how much capacity of each of the different technologies. And I don't know if people can see at the back of the room, but yellow is solar, green is wind, purple is storage, and then we've got utility scale storage like pumped hydro, then hydroelectricity, and then lastly peaking gas and liquids. Now peaking gas and liquids right now are fossil gas. There's no reason why in the future they might not be hydrogen or hydrogen-based fuel. So it doesn't necessarily mean emissions when we're looking out towards 2050. But as you can see, that red line is above all the dispatchables, and we actually aren't losing dispatchables. A tiny little bit to 2030, but a gradual increase in dispatchables as time goes on. So we're still going to have them, it's just not going to be coal and gas, it's going to be clean liquids, as in hydrogen-based, plus a whole bunch of storage. Next slide, please. This is just a lot of people are wondering, like, but how does it all work? How do wind and solar and battery and hydro and gas all work together in a future grid? This is just a sample week from the report, and you can see the line at the top is the daily. So the solid line is the hour-to-hour fluctuations of demand, and the purple below the line is when we're filling storage. The purple in the bits above the line is when we're drawing down the storage. And in this particular week, I think wind dies down completely in the middle of the week and not a lot of solar. So they ramp up the hydro and a bit of gas in the middle. But it's sort of a symphony of the 5 or 6 different generating sources all working together. So you no longer have sort of a base load with gas on top, which we had 20 years ago. You end up having them all working together with the dispatchables in the middle, filling in the gaps between supply and demand. Next slide, please. Just quickly showing how much storage we need in the network. What I think is really interesting on the right here, well, this is the amount of storage in gigawatt hours, so the amount you can draw on. Massive increase in the amount of storage for snowy, which is the grey line. But we actually build very little between now and 2030. So people are really panicking, oh, we need all this storage. Actually, we do need a lot of storage in the 2030s, 40s, 50s, but we actually don't need a lot this decade above and beyond what Snowy's giving us. So no huge hurry there, but there'll be prizes for those who get in first, I think. Next slide, please. And again, quick little fact check. Some of you will have seen the image behind. I can't put it up without superimposing these emojis on the top. The government claims that we've reduced emissions by 20%. I just want to quickly run you through why that's rubbish. A little bit off topic, but indulge me because it's relevant later. Next, please. They tell us we've reduced emissions by 20% over the last 15 years. Here is what I call real emissions, or largely fossil emissions. I've taken out the land sector, and I'll talk about that in a second, but taking out the land sector, emissions have fallen by 2.6% over the last 15 years. So effectively nothing, and you can see there's a dip at the end there. That dip is due to COVID. So at the moment, Australia's emissions reduction plan is to have a pandemic, I think. Next, please. Putting back in the land sector, you can see there, that's where the 20% comes in. Wow, look, we did a whole bunch of stuff in the years 2005 to 13 and nothing in that sector either. So actually nothing has happened in the last 8 years or so. A bit happened in that previous era, and all that is shutting down land clearing in Queensland and New South Wales. There was massive land clearing. State governments put a clamp on it, and so we They didn't stop it, by the way, but they reduced it significantly. So it's not, we didn't reduce emissions, we just stopped doing the thing that we shouldn't have been doing at the time, and a long time ago. Next slide. This just shows you more graphically how much of that decrease was in the period up until about 2013, and that there's been very little since then. There's a whole bunch of really strange accounting in that sector, and what's worse is they change the historical figures every year. So you think you got an idea of what happened, and then they tell you that the past was different every year, and so the numbers are very difficult to compare from one year to the next, and I think it's very good at confusing journalists. Next slide. We also hear that Australia is doing better than many other advanced economies. This is a really tricky one. I got this in my letterbox. Everyone here would have done the same. Our local member sent this out to everyone in Kooyong, saying that Australia is doing fantastically because we reduced emissions by 20%. None of these other countries, in fact, no other country except I think Iceland, does this land sector accounting trick. So if you take that out, we're nowhere near as good, and I'll show you in a second. Plus, there's some fine print down the bottom here, which is very, very sneaky, saying that we're comparing Australia at the end of 2020, post the COVID recession, and every other country to the end of 2019. Right, so that, it's in the fine print, so they didn't lie, right? I still call that a lie. Next slide, please. The Economist gave us a much better chart here, showing how Australia compares since they took it back to 1990, but it's pretty similar analysis if you do it from the last decade or the last 15 and the last, the last 32 here. You see that Australia is one of the rare countries that increased its emissions over that period, where most advanced economies have started decoupling from fossil fuel. Australia has barely begun. Next slide, please. Take us back to November last year. Everyone, not everyone, a whole bunch of media were very proud of Scott Morrison. He managed to force through net zero just in time for Glasgow. Next slide. I want to explain how it was no achievement. In 2015, Australia signed up to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was an agreement to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5, which means net zero. We had to get to net zero well before 2050. So in signing up to this agreement, Australia said doing our fair share meant going net zero well before. Next slide, please. The states got it. As soon as we announced that in 2015, each of the states started a process. South Australia actually announced it a couple of weeks before the Paris conference, but gradually, New South Wales and Victoria, and then Queensland, the three biggest states, announced in short order after that they would go net zero, all the way to 2020, when Northern Territory became the last state territory in Australia to announce net zero, and it was 2021 that the Commonwealth came on board. Next slide. But anyway, we went to Glasgow with this plan to get to net zero, something we'd agreed with 6 years before. And here is the chart. This is the plan. I don't know if everyone's seen this before, but this is how we're going to get there. 20% is the reductions we've got to date. Remember I told you about the 20% that we did nothing to do? 40% is a technology investment roadmap. It's not deployment of technology. It's apparently that if you just go and do a bunch of R&D, magically emissions will reduce. Well, that's nonsense. Emissions don't reduce because you invent stuff. Emissions reduce because you deploy stuff, because people put it in the ground, and there's no plan to put it in the ground. Then we're going to get magically another 15% will become just because global technology trends. That's why, because global technology trends. And then we're going to reduce another 10 to 20% because we're going to use international domestic offsets. No word on who's going to have to pay for them or how it's going to happen, but that's us paying people to reduce emissions elsewhere. And then lastly, another 15% left over, relying on further technology breakthroughs. So there's not a lot in this whole stack that actually is anything. Next slide, please. Mike Cannon-Brookes put it better than anyone, I think, when he said he's read all 129 pages of the pamphlet. Not worth the paper I didn't print it on. I I understand technology damn well. This is not a technology-driven approach. It's inaction, misdirection, and avoiding choices. I'm going to bed. This is just ridiculously embarrassing. Next slide, please. Okay, but let's see. We did actually send projections to Glasgow. We said this is what we're going to do. We're going to reduce emissions by 15% over this decade. Next slide. Let's have a look at that. Okay, there are 8 sectors of the economy here. Effectively, we've said that we are, and it's broken out here, and I'm sorry it's probably not all that straightforward to read, but I want to show you that each of the lines is level, meaning that there is no progress in any of these sectors except for one. The one sector that we're going to make progress in is the electricity sector. And that's being driven by the states, and as you will have seen by the federal government in the last couple of weeks, they really want to slow this down. They're really upset that coal's closing. So the only thing in our plan, in our federal government's plan that we sent to the UN, the only thing that's going to happen is the one thing that the feds are trying to stop. Everything else is flatline. That's how bad the plan is. Next slide. I got this slide made up for Glasgow. We had no clothes there. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to get off. I want to give you some, now I've told you the bad side, I want to give you some hope. It's all about hope. EVs, the electrification of the transport fleet, is starting to take off. Unfortunately, Australia has the slowest uptake of comparable countries. If you have a look here, USA, Spain, New Zealand, China, and what's that one? EU, right? EU, nearly 20%, and we just cracked 2%. So we've got a way to go. No surprise, we've got close to no policy. A little bit in Victoria, quite a lot in ACT, but we're starting very late. And isn't it crazy that half of the lithium in the batteries that power this entire global fleet is coming from Australia? Next slide. Same slide, but we added Norway on it. Check that out. That's a country that said, yeah, we want to decarbonise our transport sector, and they started with good policy about 2012, I think it was, and look where they are now. They're close to 90% EVs in sales. Obviously, the fleet on the road takes a while for old cars to flush through, but they're going to get there decades before we do down here at 2%. Next slide. Here's something very hopeful. This is, since I last spoke here, green steel has gone from something in the laboratory to now something at mid-scale. It's a bit more than R&D. This is a demonstration plant. It still needs to be scaled up many times, but it's now producing quantities of steel that are actually being used in early stage products that, and no, no coal is used in the production of this steel. Next slide. And they're making real stuff with it. Volvo took that was a Swedish plant, the hybrid plant by SSAB, and Volvo took that steel and made a piece of mining equipment out of it. So for the first, this is the first steel vehicle in the world that is made without coal. It's pretty amazing, huh? It's real. Next, please. A couple of quick case studies of potential for Australia. Here's a massive project up in the north of Western Australia. This is to scale, so you can imagine the size of that. If this project is built, and it's on the way, the intention is it will start being, I should say when it's built. It's starting in 2025, and the first generation will be in 2026. When this project gets going, well, if it existed today, it would be the largest power station in the world, bigger than the Three Gorges Dam in China. This power station is a mixture of wind and solar, massive amounts, 10 gigawatts of solar, which is a bit under half of what we've built in Australia, the entire country, for the last decade, all in one project, and twice as much wind energy, maybe even 3 times as much wind energy as we've built in the whole of Australia to date. And it's a very interesting area, this part of WA, in that the The wind dips during the day and is up at night, but during the day the sun is up. So you end up, by mixing the two in the right proportions, you get a very stable, very high, over 70% utilisation rate of the end infrastructure. Next slide. What do they do with this power? Their first plan is to create lots and lots of green ammonia. So that's ammonia made from green electricity or renewable energy. So the renewable energy goes into electrolyzers that pump out, well, first there's desalinated water goes into the electrolyzers, and then that goes into a plant that makes ammonia using, takes nitrogen out of the air, mixes it with the hydrogen, and sends it out through a pipe into these shipping tankers, and they'll head off to Japan. And this seemed like science fiction a year ago, but Japan's major electricity utility just put out a tender for 500,000 tonnes a year of green ammonia. And this facility that I showed you on the previous slide will make 20 times that a year. And that initially, Japan will be using that to substitute for coal. So they'll squirt it into coal-fired power stations instead of pumping coal into it. They'll do it in a blend and gradually reduce the amount of coal and increase the amount of ammonia. That might not be the smartest thing to do with green hydrogen in the long term, but it's a great way of getting the industry going. And Japan's really big on exercising supply chains and pulling through the technology development and deployment by creating the demand. They've got a really great approach to decarbonisation, I think. Next slide. This is another major project in Western Australia. It's on the Nullarbor, it's a bit inland. One thing interesting about this project is so we have these public-private partnerships in Australia, right, where a developer will get a lease on a concession like the CityLink tunnel, and they'll operate it for 30 years and then they'll give it to the government. This one's a bit different. The developer has made a deal with the traditional owners. The traditional owners will have a share of the project from day one, and at the I think the 30 or 50 year mark, if the traditional owners want it, they will take ownership of the project from that point forward. So it's sort of a public-private partnership, but with traditional owners. And it's also another massive project, bigger than the one I showed you before. But that's an idea of the kind of projects that people are talking about in Australia, where you have as much generation as we've built in the last 2 decades being built in one place, and then we can export this clean energy, in this case in form of green ammonia, but it might be up in the Pilbara, it might be going into making green steel there. So rather than sending our iron ore and our metallurgical coal across to China and India, we might upgrade the iron ore to green iron or green steel in Australia and send that and leave the coal in the ground where it belongs. Next slide. Another case study. I won't go into this in great detail, but just some of the systems thinking that's going on. This is a plan I was shown for the Hunter Valley, where a developer will first build a great big battery storage, a great big battery array, and an electrolyser farm to make hydrogen. They will use the hydrogen to make ammonia, and there's a fertiliser factory in the area. And there's also an explosives maker in the Hunter Valley. At the moment, they both, these use gas at the moment, but they'll be using renewable energy if this project goes ahead. Then with the hydrogen, some of it will go into make a plant to make iron, green iron or green steel. And then some of the electricity will go into aluminium smelting. But by having multiple sources that can be, some are more flexible than others. Batteries are very flexible. Electrolysers a little bit less. Iron making less, and aluminium a lot less. But by having those 4 different sources together with a large amount of renewables in the Hunter and in Western New South Wales, and people are now starting to talk about offshore wind off Newcastle. With those coming together, you get an integrated, low emissions, heavy industrial zone, which just a few years ago seemed like science fiction. There's an energy crisis in Europe, and as we know, there's a security crisis. Over the last few years, Russia built this massive gas pipeline called Nord Stream 2. And oddly, they didn't get it permitted before they built it. So it's built. They ran this massive, many billion-dollar gas pipeline on the floor of the Baltic Sea, and it stops just off Germany, but it's not yet permitted. They're not allowed to connect it into the German grid. And Germany just announced today that they are stopping the permitting approval process, and they are not going to take any gas from it until Russia stands down from the Ukraine, and probably a whole lot of other assurances and that. But there is a politically or a geopolitically caused energy crisis in Europe right now, and I think I expect what we're going to find is a lot of thinking in this part of Europe is going to be saying we don't want to be dependent upon Russia for gas. So I think we'll see that this geopolitical situation will only increase the speed of decarbonisation or decoupling from gas in Western Europe. Next slide. My little pun here, coal terminal. This is where our thermal coal goes in Australia. Every one of these countries has a net zero target now. Right? Every one of these countries has told us that the days of importing coal from Australia are numbered. Japan's is quite aggressive in how much they want to cut that down. So it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. But by 2030, that demand will be significantly lower. And by 2040, 2050, it's gone. Yeah, thankfully we're working on all these superpower exports because our fossil superpower status is, we've had many warning signals, but the biggest warning signals is these guys saying they want to get to net zero. Next slide. And lastly, while we can fret about federal governments not doing enough, state governments are doing a lot, and that gives us a lot of hope. And the great thing is it's of all stripes. It's not partisan energy transition at the state level. It's only for some reason at the federal level. And also, thankfully, business around the world is getting on with it. In most countries where it isn't a political football, the companies have been doing it for a long time, and their branches in this country are dragging Australia forward. But yeah, almost every significant customer-facing company in the world has committed, and many others too. And even the fossil fuel companies, there are lots of holes in their plans. They're being really tricky, but at least they are acknowledging that they have to, and they're starting to make investments. A long way to go before they get a gold star, but it's moving. Next slide. And that's it in my talk. Thank you.
So I think David's question is about revisiting the interconnector from WA across to the East Coast.
What's fascinating about how quickly things are moving is things that people dismissed 3 or 4 years ago are now being seriously thought of. So 5 years ago, I'm sure someone asked me, what do you think of offshore wind in Australia? And I'd say, oh, it'll never happen. Never happen because we've got so much land. But there are a whole bunch of reasons why offshore wind is starting to look good in Australia. Basically, the wind blows at different times of day out there, but also the power lines, you only run 15 kilometres of power line to a wind farm, and you're in a great wind zone offshore. 15 kilometres on land gets you, just to the outskirts of Melbourne. So there's, and also you can build really big and build fast at sea, easier than land. So that's an example of something that just a few years ago seemed science fiction, and now people are serious. I think there are 12 proposals for offshore wind farms around the country. Likewise with long distance interconnectors. I was in China in 2019. I went to a meeting where they were talking about all the grid projects, and they were saying that there were 20 large-scale, long-distance, ultra-high voltage DC connections. So projects that move power more than 1,000 kilometres at up to 1 million volts. These are phenomenal projects. There were 20 projects in the world. 19 of them were in China. One was in Brazil, and it was being built by the Chinese. They have just taken the technology to a new level, and in doing so brought the price down to a new level. And all of a sudden, people eyes open up to new possibilities. So the first long distance transmission line that Mike Cannon-Brooks's group looked at was called Sun Cable. Sun Cable is firstly it's a 20 gigawatt solar farm, so almost as much solar as we've ever installed in Australia, installed in one power station, I think on Newcastle Waters, a cattle station there. Would go up next to the train line pretty much up to Darwin, and then undersea past Indonesia and up into Singapore and provide 20% of Singapore's power. And it actually, I've seen the rough numbers and it pencils out, and the project looks like it makes sense financially. Singapore is very concerned about energy security and also cares about decarbonisation, and this improves, it helps them achieve their goals. Some of that big thinking has also translated people looking at major cables across the country. Probably find that the first one would be from in the north rather than in the south. Perth actually has pretty low, is relatively small demand compared to the east coast, but it would be taking advantage of the massive generation you can have up in the up in the Pilbara and Kimberley area and feeding that into the grid. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 15 years we have a great big, probably rectangular, from across the north of Australia, maybe across the south and up and down the west and east coast, massive ultra high voltage DC. I wouldn't be surprised if we have that in 15 years in Australia.
While we're on Mike and Brooks, actually, Simon, a few chat questions. Firstly, is this the new generation of business leaders sending a message to the old fossil fuel energy companies? And tied into that, what would Mike and Brooks have to do to be successful in the bid? So
we don't have a centrally planned grid. All the plans I showed you from AEMO, it's interesting, AEMO do, they anticipate what the market will do, and it's their job to make sure the transmission is there and make sure that they can supply power minute or second to second. It's their job to ensure that the grid's not going to collapse. But most of the actual investment decisions for generation are all made by the private sector in Australia. We went through quite a painful process of privatising the grid, so now the decisions on what happens to our grid is left to the private sector. And I think what you're seeing there, what we're seeing at the moment, is the tension between the government, who still hasn't quite come to terms with the fact that they let go of the grid, and private enterprise stepping up. And Mike Cannon-Brooks, sure, he's an activist, but he's not going to blow $8 billion on a vanity project. He's doing this because it makes sense. He's penciled it out, and AGL have a massive customer base, and they have the ability to build large projects. They're stuck with this really, I don't know if people remember, but 15 years ago or so, AGL were the cleanest energy company in Australia, and they used to advertise with windmills. They built the first major, the super big wind farms in Australia, and then they got a really cheap deal on a couple of coal power stations, and they became the dirtiest. They are the largest emitter in Australia, about 8% of our emissions. And Mike Cannon-Brooks and the Canadian firm Brookfield think they've got an opportunity to make some money. To be successful, well, they're going to have to convince AGL shareholders to take up the deal. And if AGL was trading at about $25 5 years ago, and we've slowly watched its share price go down to about, I think $7.20 or something like that. It's the market is not rewarding it for what looked like really cheap coal power stations a decade ago.
So the first one was about Saul Griffiths' opinion that nuclear is the way to go, perhaps, but hydrogen is not because it's too inefficient.
I remember them. So nuclear, I've studied nuclear really, really closely, and I think it's an amazing technology. The fact that we learnt how to split an atom and turn that into electricity, and then you can do all sorts of stuff with electricity. It's amazing. The same way as it's amazing that we managed to capture photons from the sun and turn them into electric car things. Yeah, so hats off to all the engineers and scientists that managed to make that work. What the engineers haven't managed to do is make nuclear cheap. It is very expensive, and at the moment there are no products that suit our market. So the world has pretty much stopped building, or almost stopped building ultra-large nuclear generators, and a lot of people are working on very small ones, but the very small ones are at least 10 to 15 years away from, well, they're 15 years away from our market at most. So a watching brief, but I'm sceptical that they will ever come down to a cost as cheap as the energy we have in Australia, or that we'll have the social licence for them in Australia. Countries like, if you're in the north of Sweden, where you might have 6 months of no sun, and maybe you're in an area, I don't know enough about the wind there, but maybe you're in an area where there's not enough wind either. Maybe there are going to be all sorts of parts of the world where these small reactors work, but I just don't see a pathway for them forward in Australia. The second question.
Hydrogen efficiency.
Hydrogen, Saul. I've had long discussions with Saul about hydrogen, and I largely agree with him that so many of the uses of hydrogen people talk about are like hydrogen in passenger cars. Pretty much not going to happen. There are 4 hydrogen cars in Victoria. There are about, I think we're coming up to something like 10,000 EVs, battery electric vehicles in Australia, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's double that number of EVs in a couple of years' time and double the number of hydrogen cars. We might get up to 8 by then. It's expensive and inefficient, costs more to run, etc., etc. But there are uses for big uses for hydrogen, like steel making, ammonia making, and if you aggregate world demand for those, it's a huge export opportunity for Australia. But no, I would be very surprised if hydrogen it has more than about 10% of the energy share in Australia ever, and maybe even 5%, and so probably even more pessimistic, he'd say 1%. The last question was about green steel making. Green steel making, there's 2 parts to it. First, with hydrogen that you've made with renewables, you use the hydrogen in a process called direct reduction of iron ore, DRI project, where you use hydrogen rather than carbon to rip the oxygen off the ferrous oxide. So you end up getting green iron out of it. And then you put that, and it's not in a very commercially usable form. It's sort of a sponge iron, I think they sometimes call that, or briquettes. You then put that in electric arc furnaces and use, so their electric arc furnaces are used in scrap iron reclaiming. So it's a 2-stage project. Use hydrogen for the reduction, the chemical reduction, and then use an arc furnace, and you combine the carbon back in to turn the iron into steel. I can tell you more about it later if you want.
There's a question in the chat about what would happen if Russia invades the Ukraine, and you spoke about how it could be geopolitics could accelerate investment in renewables. This person's asking if it could be an excuse to invest more in gas and to blame the economic need to do that.
Interesting point. What happens if people don't want to or can't use Russian gas? Europe uses a lot of Russian gas at the moment. So will they just put the call out for more gas from the US and from Australia? And maybe that happens in the short term, but it's expensive to get gas from both of those places to Europe. Plus, it wouldn't be increasing the global demand for gas, it would just be shifting the demand around. I think it's much more likely that the pressure... We've got a new coalition government in Germany that has moved all of their targets up several years, much more aggressive than they were just 12 months ago. I think you'll see that, and people will take advantage of the geopolitical risk to say we've got to get off Russian gas, we've therefore got to move move faster to substitutes for gas.
Why don't we hear anything about direct air capture of carbon? Yeah.
Yeah, so that direct air capture would be the process of taking carbon dioxide out of the air and somehow fixing it into some either solid form or injecting it, you know, down to the Earth's crust or into the bottom of the ocean or something like that. And there are some very, very early stage trials on that. I think I saw some numbers recently about one trial. It was, I think it was costing somewhere between $300 and $900 a tonne to capture the CO2 and put it underground. Meanwhile, it's free to put CO2 in the atmosphere. You can use the atmosphere as an open sewer for carbon dioxide anytime you like. Yeah? Most of us are going to hop into a car when we get out here and we're going to spew CO2 out the back for free. So trying to find people who want to pay $900 a tonne or even $300 a tonne to capture it is difficult, so there's no market unless we force people to do so. And the cheapest carbon abatement is the carbon you don't abate, so you don't emit. So many processes, well, I think about a third of industrial emissions can be reduced at net negative cost. If people implement the energy efficiency measures or the process changes, they actually save money. The next third is averages at zero, and then for the last third, well, you can do a hell of a lot of it for $20, $30, $40 a tonne of carbon. Yes, you know, there's probably a market for as we start getting emissions down near zero. Maybe there is a market for direct air capture at $50 to $100 a tonne. But while we all use the atmosphere as an open sewer, there's just no market for it.
So some people are asking that the market seems to be indicating that the best contribution or that they're moving along without contribution from the federal government. If we did have, or if the federal government did want to assist, what contribution would they be making and how much of a difference would this make?
So this is a good time to remember that electricity is only 1/3 of emissions, and you saw it going. I showed, you know, if we do this hydrogen superpower thing, it'll be going from 140 million tonnes a year down to about 4 million tonnes. So if we do that right, then electricity will actually be a rounding error. It'll be as much as is released from rubbish dumps. So that will bring the rest of the economy into sharp focus, and that's what the government hasn't even started on. That's what I wanted to try to make the case. We have 2% of new cars are electric, meaning 98% of the cars sold in the last year were ICE vehicles, and I believe in Australia that the average age of a car when it's scrapped is close to 19 years. So it's very, very slow to move the transport fleet, and we've obviously done nothing to green up aviation in Australia or heavy road transport or any of those things. So the government could start working on the tweaks to get things moving on that front, and there are a whole lot of plans that have been put to the government on how to do that in budget neutral ways that don't end up subsidising the rich to go buy Teslas. There's lots of ways we can speed up the EV adoption, as other countries have done, but we have a government that just won't look at that. So that's one thing. But to move things quickly in the electricity sector, making sure the transmission's there, making sure that you start thinking about these mega projects. How do we get cable? You know, the Sun Cable project is building a cable to Singapore, giving them emissions-free power. How crazy is it that it's easier to get a cable from Northern Territory to Singapore than it is to get one from Northern Territory to Sydney?
Okay, the question was about the seasonal problem. We generate a lot of solar power in the summer, but not as much in the winter. How do we balance it out? Is it possible?
Yeah, if we look at solar plus wind, a lot of that seasonal variation, and also look across the whole national electricity market. So if you take one technology in one place, you see a lot of seasonality. If you start adding in all the technologies, including hydro, and you look at everywhere from South Australia up to Townsville, you know, national electricity market, a lot of that seasonality is removed. There's a colleague I've worked from he's with a company called Windlab in Canberra, has done a model of Australia where he's just scaled up the generation we have. I think he said if we had 5 times as much solar and 3 times as much wind, and then a certain amount of batteries, he's run a model using real-time generation, but just scaled up that way with the right proportions in different places. And his model has been 99.9% renewable for the last 8 months that he's been running it. So we do get a lot less variation if you have that spread. But another thing is, I think that we'll get to the point where adding solar will be cheaper than adding storage. So we'll just have periods of the year where we have oodles of excess. And it's a bit like some forms of agriculture where some seasons you do throw away 10-20% of your crop, but you plant a bit more so that in a not so good season you've got enough to satisfy the market. Then the interesting thing becomes, are there opportunities for capture? When there is surplus, can we do stuff with them? So people might, there's plans for or people have done proposals for storing compressed air in massive caverns underground, or hydrogen in those caverns, or various. You could desalinate lots of water and send it into big dams if you had lots of up into the Snowy or something like that. When people are faced with free energy, they will think of really interesting things to do with it.
Thanks, Ray. In a scenario where Australia is a hydrogen superpower, how do you recommend we approach the situation of adding value to hydrogen? This person mentioned chemicals, fuels, fertilisers. What can we learn from the past? What can we do to use hydrogen to supercharge our economy?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we are not good at value adding, right? A researcher I'm doing some work with is looking at the ratio of transformed goods to raw goods in Australia, and the transformed goods as a proportion of total exports is dropping. And to give you an example, we used to export a reasonable amount of aluminium. We'd dig the bauxite out in WA, we would turn it into alumina, we'd send it across to the east coast, we'd upgrade that alumina to aluminium, and we'd export that. Over the last, about 20 years ago, we started ramping up and selling more alumina overseas, just exporting it so other people could upgrade it to aluminium. And in the last few years, Alcoa in WA have basically turned into a bauxite export company. So they're gradually dumbing down the goods. Fortunately, in the lithium space, we've done very little to date in upgrading it, but there are 2 significant refinery projects in Western Australia that are looking at using cheap energy there to upgrade the lithium ore into lithium hydroxide or something like that, I think. And then there's other processes to turn that into it's a lithium carbonate, and then from that end, people are talking that you can then. What would it take to then turn that into the cells, the actual battery cells that would go into vehicles? So I guess our lessons are, look, we're not good at taking these lessons, but some of these lessons, we actually might be lucky to have them forced upon us, in that hydrogen, it's really easy to ship coal. Really easy, just throw it in a barge and send it to China. It's really difficult to ship hydrogen. It's much cheaper to combine the hydrogen and the iron ore here to make green steel here, rather than, we would never send hydrogen overseas for someone to make steel overseas with it. It just makes no sense. Much cheaper to do here. So I think the difficulty of moving hydrogen around will mean that it won't be Australians probably who do this. It'll be like the big fertiliser manufacturers in WA are foreign companies. The big lithium upgraders are foreign companies. It'll be foreign capital that comes here, recognises that we have the minerals and we have the energy, and so we'll do the upgrading here. But we'll be the beneficiaries of that with high-skilled, lots and lots of jobs in that, which will more than amply offset the. There's only 50,000. Jobs in coal at the moment, which I think is about the same number as KFC. No, I think I got those. So what's the role for community? And I've got a hats off to independent member for Indi, Helen Haynes, who has put forward a local power plan which encourages. Creates systems to encourage communities to generate their own power and for them to benefit, receive local benefits from small, medium and large projects. Yeah, one of the things I'm most proud of is the Hepburn Wind Project. It was a wonderful project that really gave a lot of people a purpose and it had amazing social benefits that came out of the community coming together to build a significant project. And for those who don't know, it's 2 turbines up on a hill 10 kilometres south of Daylesford, and there are about 2,000 homes in the Daylesford-Hepburn Springs area, and the wind farm generates as much power as is used by all those homes. So it's and it's owned by 2,000 members in the cooperative, about half local, about half around the country, and it was the first significant community-owned renewable project in the country. We're really proud of that. We thought we were the first, not the first significant, and we found out that 100 years before, the Daylesford residents had built their own little community hydro scheme in town. So we weren't even the first in town. But yeah, other great things that come out of community energy projects, not only the local employment and keeping people's energy spend within the community, but it really helped build social licence. So when we built the project, there was a fair anti-wind sentiment in a lot of regional Victoria, but our whole area and probably a 30-kilometre radius around Daylesford was completely inoculated from all of the claims that wind farms would give you cancer or herpes or kill your goats, which all three were claimed as effects of wind farms at the time. We were inoculated from that and people were deeply engaged, and now that community has gone on we've got a zero net ZNet or something, I think they call it, where they're looking at all the other emissions in the community, and they've done bulk buy of second-hand EVs, so people are buying EVs that are low mileage but several years old out of Japan for around $20,000. They're charging with local charging stations from the local wind farm. They're putting batteries everywhere. They're replacing electric hot water with solar hot water or heat pumps. So gradually, you put a stake in the ground by doing one thing, and pretty soon people are thinking about all the things they can do to decarbonise. So I'm a huge fan of local energy, and when you look at AEMO's plans, they don't have a lot for this. They don't have a lot of vision for medium scale, but they have they've totally flipped their thinking about how significant households are. So in that storage sector, the storage chart I showed before, the biggest storage segment is, they said it was coordinated distributed energy resources, which basically means batteries in homes that are signed up as a subscription for someone to manage your battery for you to maximise the value out of your battery. If your battery's sitting doing its thing by itself, it's not a huge help to the grid, but if someone can turn it on when it's needed and charge when there's excess power and push power out when there's not enough power, then it's huge value to the grid, and they think it's going to be more energy in people's households spread across them all as there are in large-scale batteries. And there already are actually in Australia more storage is in people's homes than in the big batteries you see in South Australia and now in Victoria. And solar, more solar is on people's rooftops than in the utility solar farms in the field, and AEMO thinks there's a really big path for that. So households are playing a very major role, and thankfully that hasn't become politicised. Thankfully, even at the federal level, there is, they know that solar on rooftops is very popular. The security thing, interesting thing, interesting question, but it's still distributed. Rather than having, 25 years ago there would have been 60 generators on the east coast of Australia. Now there are about 3 million because of all the rooftops, right? 3 million, and of course most of them are small rooftops, but even there's now probably more than 1,000 projects that are greater than a megawatt, so 1,000 significant projects around the country. And that makes us a lot more resilient having a distributed network. So we won't ever get to a position where we have all of our energy being generated up in the Pilbara and having one skinny cable coming down. It'll still be distributed, but more resilient. And our reliability in the network has gone up. If you look at the historical trends for reliability, as we've got more generators and more connectivity between them, we become more resilient against natural disasters and probably malicious attacks if they ever came to be.
I haven't get seen questions answered so thoroughly ever in my whole life, and I'm pretty old, so thank you so much.